remember who Luke was originally writing the book of Acts to? Of course you do. It was a man named Theophilus. The Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts are both addressed to the very same guy. And so I think it's fairly safe for us to assume Theophilus, our faithful reader, was well acquainted with Luke's Gospel. I wonder if as he sat and read the story of Acts, if he didn't begin to see certain connections between Paul and our Lord. And both had gone on an ominous journey to Jerusalem, both in the full knowledge of the trouble that was awaiting them there. Both were taken by the Jews and handed over to the Roman authorities. Both were interrogated by a Herod. Jesus with Herod Antipas, while Paul Herod Agrippa. But then Jesus gets sent off to his death while Paul is put on a boat. It's a rather hard stop to the parallels, isn't it? Isn't it? Are we missing something? I think we might be. See, the sea in scriptures is often identified with dark forces. In the book of Exodus, God leads his people through the sea. While in Daniel and later in Revelation, the beasts come from the sea. At the end of Revelation, perhaps as a sign that evil no longer serves God's purposes, the sea is no more. And that doesn't mean that Paul was necessarily afraid of the sea, though he might have had some reservations. And prior to his journey to Rome, Paul had already been shipwrecked a number of times. Spending the night in the open sea, clinging to the broken wreckage of a boat might not be something you're anxious to repeat either. But think about it. If the way that Luke retells the story is to intentionally set Jesus in Luke and Paul in Acts in parallel, well then Jesus' crucifixion in Luke chapter 23 is set in parallel with Paul's storm-tossed voyage in chapter 27. Now please hear me on this. I'm not suggesting that Paul's voyage was in any way a redemptive act. And I'm not saying that Jesus' work on the cross is merely exemplary. There's a clear distinction between the two, but there is also a clear connection between the two. And why else would Luke spend the time he does retelling the voyage? She gives roughly the same space to the 3 years Paul spent in Ephesus. Now, the connection between cross and voyage is that the cross does not guarantee smooth sailing. In fact, Luke tells us in Acts 27, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. Now, most of us are not going to find ourselves shipwrecked for the gospel. But those of us who proclaim the message of Christ's crucifixion, there will be resistance from dark and cosmic powers. And we're called to endure. N.T. Wright puts it this way: the storms do not mean that the journey is futile. They merely mean that Jesus is claiming the world as his own, and that the powers of the world will do their best to resist. The consequences of the cross are for those who call to proclaim it. It's conflict with the world and powers that reject our message. The voyage is how we take up the cross. It's not how we earn it. It's how we identify with it. Seems like for many of us, when we find ourselves on rough seas, like when we face storms and adversity, we wonder, am I doing something wrong? Is God upset with me? Did I make a wrong turn? Where is he? Actually, sometimes the storm arises not from doing the wrong thing, but from doing the right thing. Conversely, the lack of adversity in our lives could be a sign that we're not doing anything in our lives worthy of resistance. I don't wish storms on any of us. I do pray for faithfulness from all of us. The kind that takes up a cross. Sometimes provokes a storm, but always pleases our Lord. Have a blessed week.